Hello guys, I'm here in Charleston, South Carolina in lieu of Black History Month. I'm here at the McLeod Plantation here in Charleston, South Carolina. Here is a building of the cotton gin. You can see this was some of the areas where they work. Right now I'm trying to get footage and get information while we're on our tour here at the McLeod Plantation in lieu of Black History. As you can see, this is on James Island. This is like a sea island, and this is the information on the cotton plantation here. This is the house where the former slaves where they did their work. I'm trying to show some other areas.
You want to talk about the fingers?
This right here, as you can see, this is like the fingerprints of some of the young slave children where they helped build this building. As I go closer, you can see their fingerprints of the brick. They go 3 little fingerprints of some of the children. And these children were like 5 to 6 years old. Get more footage of.
Back to the water. I can see people way down there. We can imagine that Leah is being brought over on a boat that might have delivered the cotton. She's being brought back with other supplies. To enter into Leah's story, what might be helpful is for you to imagine some of your earliest memories. You can remember back to about 5 or 6 years old. Now, how old are you? 8, so you don't have that far back to remember. But for the most part, we as adults, we can remember back to when we were about 5 or 6 years old. Maybe you're thinking of something good or bad, not asking to share it. It may be imperfect, memories often are, but they are part of your stories. And think about how you pass on stories. You do not pass on to children copies of your bills, copies of your census information.
These are some of the other houses that the slaves they lived in on this plantation.
The stories that you would pass on later in life.
This is the mansion where McLeod, the slave owner, this was his home, as they call the big house on the plantation. This is the big home of the slave owner, William McLeod. This is what we will call the big house.
Describing what slave traders would call a coffle. Coffle comes from an Arabic word. It means caravan. And if we were part of that caravan, the men in the group would be chained together. Women and children would be tethered together by rope. And if we were all moving in this coffle and we're being forced to walk for a couple of days, roughly how far would we walk? What do you think? What estimate do you have? 20 miles is the estimate I'm working with from a man named Eugene Frazier. Eugene Frazier, African-American man in his 80s now, local historian. His family has roots in this experience. And he's estimating about 20 miles that this group's moving from rice plantations on the other side of Mount.
Hello guys, happy Saturday. I'm here at McLeod's Plantation down here in Charleston, trying to get some footage for Black History Month. You can see some of the buildings behind me. This way, this was the big house where the slave master, where he lived. You see some of the slave homes there.
Now, Leah remembers it this way. If you don't mind, she remembers that those rocks hurt her feet. She remembers that her feet were bruised, swollen, muddy, she said. She said other
This is
people's
our
feet
tour
were too.
guide as he explains some of the history
She
of
remembers
the
those who could see
plantation.
were looking for objects off to the side that they could protect their feet with. Things she'd know later to be newspapers, and certainly rags. And as the group entered into a small building downtown, they were given more rags and more newspapers, told to begin wiping themselves off, to clean up. What kind of building have they entered into? Now, this is a slave market, an auction house. Again, we know a lot about the business of slavery. For instance, as we're headed into the Civil War period, the 1860s, there were more than 40 auction houses in downtown Charleston. They weren't large outdoor spaces where people were traded openly so much. It's more discreet at that point. The only people going in and out of those buildings are people being bought and sold. And of course, those doing the buying and the selling and the trading. Now, the busiest of the auction houses was a place called Ryan's Mart, owned by Thomas Ryan. Slave traders from Alabama to Virginia knew about Ryan's Mart. Many couples headed in that direction, down on a cobblestone street called Chalmers Street. Have you walked Chalmers Street yet? Yeah. Downtown? Yeah, down here. Now, that market today, that building's still down there. If you walk the street, you can see MART on the top of one of the buildings. That building's now owned by the city of Charleston, and it's now called the Old Slave Mart Museum. I encourage you to go there to learn more about this history, learn more about that remarkable 5 or 10 minutes when all these things are at play, when somebody's lobbying to keep their family together, whereas a trader is trying to make the most money as possible, whereas a purchaser is using whatever decision they have to keep a family together or split them apart. But it's the Old Slave Mart today. That's the spot where Leah is sold and separated from her parents. I do believe she'd be coming from that direction, coming toward us. She's purchased by McLeod Sr. Her parents are purchased by the Rivers Plantation. But why did McLeod Sr. purchase her? Why did he buy a 5 or 6-year-old girl? I can't tell you for sure, but in a moment we're going to go up near his house and we're going to learn more about McLeod Sr. And we're going to speculate as to why he might have made that purchase. But in the meantime, what I want to give to you, I have 3 copies of an advertisement from Ryan's Mart. An advertisement. This is for the sale of people who would have arrived at Ryan's Mart by coffle. 25 people are for sale in this particular event. They seem to be grouped by families. If I was to interpret this a little bit, I could see number 4 on the list is Abram, 25 years old, prime field hand. Abram's value at that time would have been about $1,000 to $2,000, depending on the market, for cotton or for rice. That's upwards of $40,000 today. Leah, at about 5 years old, according to the Old Slave Mart Museum, her value was about $175. That's about $5,000 today. Now, why did McLeod Sr. purchase Leah? I would like you to take a look at these, keep passing around, start asking yourself that question. Begin to speculate. Why would he have purchased that little girl? I'll see you right up here by the columns whenever you're ready.
These are people, you're not listening. This is an advertisement. Yes, that's a person's name that got sold here. Like I said before, this is the big house, the slave owner house. It was on this plantation.
Does anyone else want to see the advertisement?
You want to see this, honey?
We saw it.
You saw, okay, sorry.
There you go.
Oh, it's the same one.
Yeah.
So folks, let's just slide over this way a little bit, if you don't mind, so we can make sure she can join us. Why might McLeod Sr. have purchased 5 or 6-year-old Leah? Speculate with me.
It's a playmate.
What do you think? Playmate for a child? It's possible.
Help in the kitchen.
We know that McLeod Sr.'s daughter, Annie, based on the census information, she's being recorded by name, by gender, and by age. Annie was about 8 years old. It's possible.
Help her in the kitchen.
Help in the kitchen. I described some of the work that she might be involved in, things like molding. We can expect that children would work. We know that based on the bricks telling us that children would work. If she was of lighter skin color, where might she be destined to work? This big house behind you here. Now, I have numerous African-American visitors as well as African-American coworkers. One thing that I have learned about while working here, something I did not know much about before being here, is the notion of colorism. The idea of feeling ranked based on skin color. That's in part born from exactly the history we're unpacking together. Why else might she have been purchased?
She'd have a long life.
A long life?
I mean, he'd get more value out of her. She's
More
early,
value
she's
out of
young,
her,
and
buying her younger.
stay longer.
Less trouble, everything.
Oh, you think she might be more compliant and learning things? That's possible. All right, so thanks for brainstorming for a minute. We'll return back to some of that in a moment. But I want to teach you what I do know about McLeod Sr., William Wallace McLeod Sr. I know a bit about him. He would have been literate. He's fairly significant locally in history. He leaves a lot of information behind. This gentleman, William Wallace McLeod Sr., is a South Carolinian born in 1820. Born in 1820. His family line would go back to Isle of Skye, Scotland, though I'm not aware that he had visited Scotland. He himself is coming from rice plantations down the coast a little ways. Rice plantations near Edisto River. And he's coming up to James Island, this island, in 1851 when he's about 31 years old. And he's coming up to this island to marry a woman named Susan Lawton. And he's not just marrying Susan for love. Why else might he be marrying her? You don't want to think about that for a minute? Some of you might have said it as well.
The plantation.
Money. She has money. She has a dowry, actually. She's part of the Lawton Plantation, well-established local plantation. Indeed, if you met Dory a few minutes ago, Dory's a Lawton as well. Dory's happy to talk about her family's history and how it's intersected with all of this. But by marrying her, he gets access to more money. He and his wife are then able to purchase roughly 1,700 acres, and they're going to call it McLeod Plantation in 1851. Keep in mind, they buy this land from the McKenzie brothers. Land before that had been owned by the Lightwood family, the Pierno family. The line of slave owners and enslaved people on this site goes much farther back than the McLeods, beginning in 1850. Now, that receipt said $11,500. That's about $330,000 today. We do not know for sure if any enslaved people were part of that purchase. It's possible. We do know that receipt set accommodations for 90 slaves on this site. Where were those accommodations? Do you remember? Off to the west. We're heading that way. Now, do you remember how many buildings had been there according to maps during the period of slavery? Up to 23 buildings. They used to be on both sides of the oak trees heading off to the west. There are only about 6 buildings remaining today, and they've gone through changes because people lived in those buildings and used them until 1990, not too long ago. Buildings change whenever we continue to live in them. Now, McLeod Sr., he's a farmer. Well, he's a planter. Think of a planter as a farmer who owns a good deal of human beings, and he wants to grow his wealth and his status and his power. The planter class would be the top of everything socioeconomically. He's also a secessionist. What does that mean? He expresses his views on secession in the 1850s. What does he want to see happen? Yeah, well, in particular, he's probably thinking about his state. He'd like to see South Carolina break away from the rest of the United States. Why? If he was standing here with us, what might he say as to why he wants that?
Money.
The slaves and his money.
All right, so he's obviously concerned about anything that's impacting his ability to own slaves, because the North is beginning to not allow that. He might even use the very simple word that we throw around a lot in our country. He might, as strange as it sounds, say it's because of his freedom. He might say, in order for him to be free, he needs to be able to do exactly the kinds of things we're describing. Now, I know that sounds outlandish, but as we continue to unpack this story, let's chew on that particular word. Got more to share with you. Now, secession does occur. Lincoln's elected in November 1860. By December, South Carolina is the first state to vote to break away. Other states are going to follow suit. The Confederacy is going to be formed. By April of 1861, the war is going to begin. The Civil War. Those first shots are fired onto where? Fort Sumter. Where is it from here? This is my favorite part of the tour because I get to watch where you're going to point. Where is it from here? Look around. Look at everybody. All right, I'm going to go with her. She's got it down. Fort Sumter's off in this direction. Federal troops are out there, and the Confederates are firing upon them. Now, keep this in mind. Those first shots are fired from this island, a place called Fort Johnson. As sure as we hear the traffic noise here, I hear some right now. As sure as you hear that traffic noise, the people on this site, April 1861, they would have heard the first shots of the American Civil War. What did it mean to them? McLeod Sr., literate, very much in the know. I suspect for him it was something like, right on, here we go. This is what he's looking for. Now, he would become a Confederate soldier. He's about 41 at that point. Because he's a planter, he gets voted into this special group called the Charleston Light Dragoons. Dragoons were cavalry, basically. They existed before the Civil War, the planter class. Imagine him on horseback, sword in a scabbard. He's mostly involved in guarding spaces. Dragoons brought slaves with them to cook for them and clean for them. Soldiers nonetheless. Now, he doesn't die in battle. He dies of natural causes before the end of the war. He's buried about 35 miles inland from here. Now, we're talking about this because we're trying to learn about him to speculate as to why he might have purchased Leah. He obviously participated in the local slave trade. He owned 74 people based on that 1860 census. When he died in February 1865, his will said he owned 100 people. 74 to 100 people. That's what we work with here. But he was also an advocate for reopening this. And I want to talk about this. This is very significant to American history. This is a depiction of what we call the transatlantic slave trade. The transatlantic, across the Atlantic Ocean slave trade. Now, we talk a lot about slavery. Slavery, of course, is universal in human history. It's occurred in many locations under many different circumstances. But this is tied to the slavery that occurred where we live. Now, I want to talk about it for a moment because it's very unique for several reasons. For one, is the length of time this was taking place. Over 3 centuries. The 1500s into the 1800s. More than 3 centuries. It's also unique because it focused exclusively on enslaving black Africans. Men, women, and children. And again, because it was business, we know that there were 20,500 slave trading voyages over those 300 plus years. 12.5 million black Africans were loaded onto those ships. Do you think all 12.5 million made it to the Western Hemisphere? They did not. Only about 10 million do. So about 2.5 million die in passage. Failed revolts, diseases, suicide. And you can tell by the arrows, people are being brought to places like South America, mining operations. People are being brought to sugarcane plantations because the world has this desire for sweet things at this point. And plantations are going to feed that desire. These islands called the West Indies, numerous European countries had colonies in these locations. Cotton was being grown there in places like Barbados. Of course, the arrows get smaller when you get near the United States. About 500,000 people were brought to the United States as part of the transatlantic slave trade. That was about 1619 to 1808. But here's my question for you. How do we get from roughly 500,000 people being brought over all the way up by 1860 to 4 million people being enslaved in the country? It tells us something about why he was purchasing Leah. Reproduction, breeding. You cannot understand slavery without understanding that fundamental phenomenon. If you're going to grow the wealth of somebody like McLeod Sr., his power, his status, if you're going to expand cotton, if you're going to create the economy that we all are now living upon in many ways, we have to understand this dark aspect of our history. Now, historians will also say at times that the number of enslaved people in the country in 1860, their value was considered to be greater than the total value of the nation's railroads and factories combined. So McLeod Sr. is coming onto this scene. His idea of freedom is developed over 300 years, essentially, hasn't it? Think about this. You got a smartphone in your hand right now. How long have we had smartphones? 20 years, maybe? Maybe, yeah. Think of how much it's changed our lives. Imagine something going on for 300 plus years. When I say, I know it sounds crazy that McLeod Sr. is talking about his idea of freedom is this, but when it takes place over generations upon generations upon generations, people will often say, as we're talking about racism, which is what we've been discussing, people will often say, well, you know, he owned slaves because that's what he knew. What he knew was this racist economy. And this is what he expected in terms of his freedom. Now, how do I know he was an advocate for this? I'm going to pass around for you an example of the research we do. This is a primary source document. Charleston Courier newspaper, 1859. A group of men are gathering together to talk about how to reopen the transatlantic slave trade to Charleston. They're talking about bringing more labor from Africa. One of the highlights here, a vice president of this group, William Wallace McLeod Sr. This is part of how we know this history. Now, in addition to things I just described, McLeod Sr. was also a father and a husband. He was actually married twice. Both of his wives died before 1860. One of his wives, second wife, was quite young. She died in childbirth. With his 2 wives, he had a total of 7 kids. Do you think all those kids lived? No. 4 of them are going to die. So imagine roughly half of the kids in this group being gone. So only 3 of his kids are going to live to adulthood. Now, if you can imagine them stepping out of this house, they'd be coming out of a back door here. They'd perhaps be walking about the other side. Annie'd be coming in this direction. So I'll ask you one more time, why might McLeod Sr. have purchased Leah? It could certainly have been for breeding. It certainly could have been for working in things like cotton, moding. It certainly could have been to work in this home. He may well have also purchased her as a playmate for one of his children. Annie, for instance, who was about 8 years old, you'll see a banner about Annie inside the house. She lost her mother, her stepmother, several of her siblings. He might have done what a father might do, trying to figure out how to console his young child. What he did, perhaps, was purchase someone like Leah as a playmate. Now, I can't tell you definitively. I do think she's coming from the waterway. I'm very confident that where she's going to be taken care of in her early days here is the building where we're going to wrap things up. We're going to head over by the kitchen building, and we're going to learn about it, and we're going to learn about Leah's life all the way to 1931. Join me right over there. I appreciate your patience. We've straggled on and made a longer tour today. That's all right. You are welcome to step away if you like. Folks, this is one of the older buildings on site. This building goes back to the early 1800s. It would have been here prior to the McLeod house being built. This is a kitchen building. It's been used for different purposes. For instance, this building in the 1940s, one of William McLeod's sister, Wilhelmina, she was actually in the 1940s president of South Carolina's chapter of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. She kept Confederate memorabilia in this space. But if we're thinking about Leah's time, when she's about 5 or 6 and she's coming to this space, that's about 1860, more or less. So at that time, perhaps you can imagine smoke rising from the chimney, maybe a fire in the fireplace. You can imagine food is being prepared here, meals. 1 or 2 ladies are here providing meals for the family living in the big house. Now they may be sending some staples in the direction of the slave cabins, but for the most part, their energy is devoted towards supporting that big house or whatever big house was here prior to the McLeods. They also, if you're thinking about the food, I should probably mention that the foods of Charleston, of course, were conceived and perfected by the culture of enslaved people. Right about now, you're probably thinking about dinner. If you're thinking about things like shrimp and grits, rice and bean dishes like hop and john, okra, yam, sweet potatoes, those are all gullah foods. And they're all coming out of this space right here, passed down even to us today. Now these ladies, in addition to meals, they would be responsible for laundry, maybe indoors as well as right out here. But in addition to meals and laundry, they would also look after young children. Children not old enough to be out independently working. So what is this space if kids are here at that time? It's not just a kitchen, it's not just laundry. No, this is daycare on a plantation. Now, Leah does not talk specifically about arriving to this spot, but we know how this spot would operate. And we believe this is where she would likely be taken and cared for at the beginning. Now, use your imagination right now. What might she look like? What might be her physical state, her emotional or psychological state? You can decide that with your imagination. Would she be expected to work when she arrived right here? What kind of work might she suddenly be doing? Keeping her busy in this space. She could be doing something with the laundry, indeed.
Helping younger children.
Helping younger children. What would this building constantly need that she might be expected to help with? Water, perhaps. Shuttling water from the well. Wood. Getting kindling. How might she... Well, I'll frame it this way. I want to think about how she might have felt some comfort when she arrived here, too. One of my coworkers is an African-American man named John Gardner. John is Gullah, part of the local culture descended from all of this. John is 4 generations removed from slavery. And I was listening to John teach one day, and he reminded me, as he was telling his tour, that when Leah walked up here, she might have gained some comfort from a couple of things. She might have heard a voice, a woman's voice, and heard a dialect that's somewhat similar to John's when he's talking. That Gullah Geechee dialect. She might have heard that language, and that might have given her some small amount of comfort in that moment. And she might have tasted foods that were not so different than what her mother made. What did she eat that day when she came up? Are you imagining grits? Are you imagining rice? Yams? What do we often call that southern food? We call it comfort food, don't we? Is this partly why we call it that? You got to decide in this story. Now, I will give you some specifics about what she might have encountered. In fact, I want to pass around a document. It's from a plantation manual. It would have been written by a planter. Now, we don't have a plantation manual for this site. McLeod Sr., I don't know if he created such a thing. He might have been reading these kinds of documents, but this one comes from a plantation a little inland from here, South Carolina, and it's describing some things that I think might be relevant to how Leah experienced this site. It's describing children for a moment. It says there is a separate apartment under the charge of a trusty nurse where the children are kept during the day. This could be a spot like that. It also says 4 quarts of meal, 3 quarts of hominy, and 2 pounds of bacon are found sufficient for about 20 children. Flip it over, we can learn a little bit about how mothers who are suckling their children, how they were expected to be ultimately pulling away from them. And I'll read it for you. It says, sucklers are not required to leave their house until sunrise when they leave their infants at the children's house before going to the field. The period of suckling is 1 year. For 6 months, they return 3 times a day to suckle their infants, in the middle of the morning, at midday, and in the middle of the afternoon. Slide down the paragraph, it says, at 10 months, they return at midday only. Each woman on weaning her child is required to put it in charge of some woman without a child for 2 weeks, and not to nurse it at all during that time. It occurred to me one day that maybe Leah had already been experiencing so much separation. That doesn't mean she's not experiencing great trauma, but this perhaps wasn't the first time she'd been pulled away from her mother. Perhaps not at all. Feel free to take a look at this as you're imagining her circumstances. What I want to allow you to do when I'm done with this story is that you're going to get a chance to walk into this space. And I want to tell you a little bit about what I know of Leah, but I have to tell you that she's going to survive the Civil War. Her parents survived as well. They're going to end up staying on James Island, as so many people would. They're going to be coming back to find each other. And her parents do find her. Now, she would have somehow or another survived when the Confederate Army occupied this site. They evacuate in 1865, about the same time McLeod Sr. died. She would have survived, for instance, the United States troops being on this site. Even troops that were African Americans, part of the Massachusetts 55th. They were here too, wearing blue uniforms. She would have been here on this island when the Freedmen's Bureau was on this site. The Freedmen's Bureau was helping with things like stopping the smallpox epidemic on the island. She survived smallpox. I don't know if she had it, but she didn't die of it. She would have maybe benefited from food and medicine from the Freedmen's Bureau. It's possible she began to be part of schooling in some way. Her family might have gotten one of the land claims that were distributed by the federal government from properties like this. However, all those land claims are actually taken back by the federal government. Land was returned to the planters, especially as Washington, D.C. began to decide that the best way to deal with emancipated African Americans, in their mind, was not for them to own the land, but rather for the white planters to own the land and start that tenant farming structure with wage labor. Leah's family would have navigated all of that. What I do know is that Leah ultimately marries a man named Peter, and they have 3 children. One of the children was named Lizzie Brown. And one of Lizzie's children is actually in my arms right here, and I want you to meet her. This is Edna, one of Leah's granddaughters. Now, Edna was born on McLeod Plantation in 1914. She's born in 1914. Her house was down there over where the shopping center is today. In an interview she gave once, she said, my house was right by where the Piggly Wiggly is, the grocery store. It's since been replaced by a Harris Teeter grocery store. Now, she's born in 1914 as part of a tenant farming family. That means her family's leasing one of the dwellings from the McLeods. 9 kids, 2 adults. She called it her mama's house down there. It's also the Jim Crow era, an era of segregation, an era of lynching. And when she was a little girl, she said when she was about 6 years old, about 1920, she was sitting on the steps, maybe at her mama's house or somewhere around here, sitting on the steps listening to stories from her grandmother Leah. One of those stories I just passed on to you. She remembers her grandmother talking about a walk through a woods, blindfolds, getting into a boat to cross a body of water, bloody feet on hard surfaces downtown, being sold at an auction house, and arriving at a place without her parents. course, Edna would pass these on to her family. But I've been thinking about this, and this is my opinion, but I've been thinking that it's not just that the story was told, it's about when it was told. Do you think that when Leah was telling Edna these stories on one of these steps in 1920 or so, was the story meant to just be entertainment? Was this tour meant to just be entertainment?
No.
No, I've got to believe that these stories, they must have been life lessons, they must have been instructions and courage on how to keep moving forward to these circumstances. You know, because at that time when Edna's hearing these stories, certainly she's seeing signs like this. She's already begun to see that she's being treated as a second-class citizen in an era like that. She's not an enslaved person, but certainly she is that. And if we thought about Edna for a moment, take a look at this picture. Edna, born in 1914, would live to be almost 98 years old. So do the math for me. If you live, born in 1914, and you live to be 98, what year do you pass away? What do you think? 2012. Now, what year were you born? 2009. You could have met Edna. How about you, young man?
2011.
All right, 1 year old. You could have met her. How about you, young lady? What year were you born? 2011. You were 1 year old when she was alive. What year were you born?
2008.
2008. You could have met her too. There's nobody in this group that, in theory, could not have sat down and met Edna if we were here at the same time. And you would have heard stories about her grandmother, not just stories about slavery. Too often we talk about slavery in this country as being especially cruel poverty or long, long hours of work. But what we've been talking about together is chattel slavery, people owned by other people, people appearing on slave schedules, on tax documents, all aspects of their lives, including whether or not they're kept with their parents, being determined by someone else. Now, of course, Edna would pass along these life lessons, these stories to her family. And I'll give to you, for example, an obituary for Edna. When she passes away in 2012, she had had 7 kids herself. One of her children had been a soldier in the Vietnam War. He died serving the country. But when she passed away, as it says on this obituary, when she passed away in 2012, she had 40 grandchildren. 40.
Wow.
54 great-grandchildren. 3 great-great-grandchildren. More than 100 descendants. And as you took a look at this page, keep in mind that none of them would be here on this page without that little girl that you just spent time bringing to life, Leah. And I asked you earlier, do you think that any of the people on that page, for instance, are ever here as part of tours? Of course they are. Here's an example. Here's an example. This picture, where was it taken? Were we just there a moment ago? Where's the lady with the brace? She were more or less sitting almost in that same location. Now, in the middle of this picture is a gentleman who lives not too far in that direction. His name is David. And David is a nephew of Edna. Wow. Which means he's also a great-grandson of Leah. Do you think he's heard these instructions from his family? These life lessons, these stories? Certainly. I appreciate that he was on the tour. He said, thank you, good job with Leah's story. He said, it is important, though, that I tell these stories myself, talk about my family myself. So indeed, afterward, that's what people were doing. They were gathering, spending time with David as he was telling stories about living here on James Island through this history. He did not spend a whole lot of time talking about Leah at that point, but he did talk about his lifetime. He's 76. David would become a lawyer through the civil rights movement. He also said he's a sailor. He reminded that many African Americans locally who are part of the Gullah culture, very attached to water. That's part of the reason he's a sailor. He also described that he has an Airbnb in town, and he was describing that one way to participate in the local culture is to come to businesses such as his and others, to seek these out, to experience the local economy from that perspective. But he also reminded me of this, and I'm paraphrasing, but he reminded me that we don't just come to these plantations because of the beautiful trees or the beauty that exists here. And certainly I don't want you to come just to learn about the oppression that occurred here. What David reminded me is that we can also learn about the qualities that families like his have demonstrated as they've endured and resisted and moved through that oppression. Families like his showed a lot of courage, strength, and resilience. In essence, what you've been learning about the entire time is the local African American culture, the Gullah Geechee culture, which is all up and down the coastline from roughly St. Augustine, Florida, up to Wilmington, North Carolina. This is roughly where the rice plantations were forming from about 1700 onward. Of course, they would become cotton experts as well, and they would have to endure and overcome and move through all of this. It's a remarkable culture. I hope you interact with the Gullah Geechee culture while you're here in town. If you want a handout that goes into greater detail about the origins of these terms and the history of this culture, certainly when you go into the house, right on the table inside, you're going to see a handout about the Gullah Geechee culture. I'm going to hang out as well for any conversations you want to have. Keep in mind the Welcome Center closes at 4 should you need to get down there, but I will not lock you in to the parking lot. I'm glad you're here. Thanks for being here. Thanks for your patience as we reflect.
Thank you. Great job.
Great job, man.
Sure.
I guess maybe 8 or 9 years ago, I did a tour of the Gullah Geechee.
Now we about to take a look inside the house of the kitchen where the slaves prepared meals, they washed clothes, did everything for the big house, which we'll be going into next. This is like a small space in here.
If you go, I'll go.
We adapted. We were kind of a ragtag group, and we had a lot of questions too at times.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Feel free to take a look inside there, folks.
Now I'm about to go inside the big house.
I won't. He said go in there.
Well, William McLeod, he was the slave plantation owner. He lived inside this house. So about to take a look inside. And guys, I'm here at the McLeod Plantation here in Charleston, South Carolina, in lieu of Black History Month. These are some of the photos here inside the main foyer of the home. As you can see, they're not going to allow anyone to go upstairs. This is the stairwell inside the home. This is the back porch of the home. You can kind of get a glimpse of the plantation from this view, and you can see the field in the front of me. This is like a huge plantation too. Yes, I'm on the grounds of the slave plantation, McLeod's, and now this is probably where some of our ancestors may have worked. This is here in Charleston. This kind of reminds me of what I see on the movie Roots, like this house. It kind of puts me in the mind of that. And there's straight ahead is the old cotton field where the slaves worked, where they picked cotton. Ahead of me. Okay guys, this is all for right now. I'm signing off. I will post this story. This is also, you can see a good view of this home from this view here. I will post this story on my webpage, www.aprilblog.online. You can follow up on there. Goodbye everybody. Thanks for watching.